Elon Musk just became the first trillionaire in history, which, let's be honest, doesn't exactly help shut down the theory that the guy is an alien. I mean, he builds rockets, he wants to colonize Mars, he's messing around with artificial intelligence, and now he's piled up a fortune so big it's almost impossible to picture. Honestly, if Elon ever came out and admitted he was an alien, I think more people would be asking if the spaceship comes with Tesla Arcade than asking what galaxy he's from. When someone hears the word trillionaire, the first image that pops into their head is usually a person sitting on top of a giant mountain of cash. Like there's some massive vault hidden somewhere on the planet with bills stacked all the way up to the ceiling. A mix of Scrooge McDuck and Tony Stark on steroids. But the truth is very different. And understanding how Elon actually got to $1 trillion reveals something fascinating about money, about companies, and most of all, about how people see value. But before we get to the trillion, let's rewind a few decades to understand how Elon Musk pulled this off. Back in the 90s, he started a company called Zip2. Then came X.com, which would eventually turn into PayPal. When PayPal got sold to eBay, Musk walked away with around $180 million, which would be something like $320 to $340 million in today's money. That's more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Buy a few mansions, a yacht, and spend the next 50 years doing absolutely nothing. But Musk wanted more. He took almost everything he had and bet it on ideas that pretty much everybody thought were impossible. One wanted to turn electric cars into something people actually craved. The other wanted to build reusable rockets to make space travel way cheaper. Today, that sounds normal, but back then, it sounded like the plot of a sci-fi movie. And there were plenty of moments where it all nearly fell apart. Tesla came right to the edge of bankruptcy. SpaceX racked up a pile of exploding rockets. Investors lost faith, experts predicted disaster, and a whole lot of people were certain it would never work. But it did. Tesla became one of the most valuable car makers on the planet. SpaceX became the most valuable space company in the world. And Musk's fortune grew right along with it. First came the millions, then the billions, then tens of billions, then hundreds of billions, until it hit a number so absurd that if Einstein came back to life, he'd spend more time counting the zeros than explaining the theory of relativity. $1 trillion. And that didn't creep up slowly, it happened on a single day. June 12th, 2026, the day SpaceX finally went public. The biggest IPO in history sent the company soaring past a $2 trillion valuation, and Elon's slice of it tipped him right over the line, into trillionaire territory. But hold on, how much is $1 trillion really? The honest answer is, nobody can really picture it. The human brain just wasn't built to handle numbers that big. So let me try it a different way. Think in seconds. 1 million seconds is about 11 days. 1 billion seconds is about 31 years. But 1 trillion seconds is more than 31,000 years. Just stop and let that sink in for a second. The gap between 1 billion and 1 trillion is so enormous that the two numbers almost feel like they belong to different universes. And that's exactly where the most interesting question of all shows up. Where is all that money? When we hear a $1 trillion fortune, it's natural to imagine there's a place where all of it is sitting. A bank, a vault, or, knowing Elon, maybe a secret base on Mars. But most of that fortune doesn't exist as cash sitting in some account. It exists in the form of stock. And here's the phrase that explains the whole thing: rich on paper. Picture a house bought for $300,000. A few years go by, the neighborhood gets better, new businesses move in, the area gets more desirable. Then a realtor shows up and says that same house is now worth $1 million. Simple question: did the owner just get $700,000 richer? Yes and no. On paper, his net worth went up, but that money never landed in anyone's bank account. The house is worth more only because other people believe it's worth that much. The same thing happens with Elon, except instead of a house, he owns pieces of giant companies. And the price of those pieces changes constantly. To get it, just think of the stock market as a marketplace. Just like there's a market for houses or cars or land, there's also a market for tiny pieces of companies. We call them shares. When you buy a share of Tesla, you're buying a little piece of the company. And the price of that piece comes down to one single question: how much is someone willing to pay for it? If millions of investors believe a company has a bright future, they'll pay more. If they think it's headed for trouble, they pay less. That's why there's a famous saying on Wall Street: the market buys the future. When people invest, they're not just looking at what a company is worth today. They're trying to guess what it'll be worth 5, 10, even 20 years from now. And maybe this is the most fascinating part of the whole story. The value of things is in the eye of the beholder. A painting can be worth $20 to one person and $20 million to another. A house bought for $300,000 can be worth $1 million a few years later. And a company worth $100 billion today can climb into the trillions if the market believes it's going to own the future. None of those values fall out of the sky. They all come from the same thing: perception of value. That's why Elon can make hundreds of billions of dollars without selling a single extra car, or lose hundreds of billions without a single rocket disappearing. If the confidence changes, the valuation changes. And when the valuation changes, the fortune changes right along with it. Maybe that's why so many people get confused by the word trillionaire, because they're picturing money when what they're really looking at is value. And there's a huge difference between the two. Money is what's available to spend right now. Value is what people believe something is worth. And here's a detail almost nobody talks about. A fortune made of stock is just as powerful as it is unstable. Because Elon's money is tied to the value of his companies, he doesn't have to do anything at all to gain or lose amounts that sound like fiction. On a single bad day in the market, he's watched his own fortune shrink by tens of billions of dollars. Over a few months, he once lost more than $200 billion, enough to single-handedly set the record for the biggest personal wealth loss in history. And here's the wild part. On those days, not one car went unsold, not one rocket blew up, not one factory shut down. The only thing that changed was the market's mood. It's like owning that $1 million house and suddenly finding out the neighborhood fell out of fashion. On paper, you got poorer. In reality, the house is exactly the same. Being a trillionaire deep down is like living on a roller coaster where the numbers shoot up and drop faster than any rocket SpaceX has ever launched. But let me give you a little thought experiment. Imagine that one day, Elon wakes up feeling like the most generous man in history, and he decides to do something nobody's ever done. Take his entire fortune and split it equally between every single human being alive on Earth, all 8 billion plus people on the planet. How much would each person get? $1 trillion divided by 8.2 billion people comes out to about $122 each. And here's where that number means something completely different depending on where you are on the map. To you, $122 might be an electric bill, a nice dinner out, a pair of sneakers. But in one of the poorest countries on the planet, like Burundi, the average person earns around $240 for an entire year. So those $122, your slice of the biggest fortune in history, would be worth nearly 6 months of work for someone on the other side of the world. Half a year of somebody's life, wrapped up in what, to Elon, is basically invisible. But now, here's the part almost nobody realizes. Even if he wanted to, Elon couldn't actually do it. Because to put those $122 in each person's hand, he'd first have to turn the fortune into real money, meaning sell the stock. And the very second he started dumping that much SpaceX onto the market, the price would start to crash. The fortune that looked so solid would just evaporate right in his hands before it ever reached the first person in line. That's the paradox of the richest man in the world. He has $1 trillion that, at the same time, he doesn't have. At the end of the day, the story of humanity's first trillionaire isn't just a story about money. It's a story about confidence, about expectation, and about the market's ability to bet on a future that hasn't even happened yet. The first trillionaire in history didn't get rich stacking bills in a vault. He got rich collecting pieces of companies that millions of people believe in. So maybe the most accurate way to describe Elon Musk's fortune isn't to say he has $1 trillion. Maybe the right way to put it is that he has $1 trillion in market confidence. And that, deep down, is even more impressive than the money itself. And honestly, the market basically admitted it. Even the analysts said SpaceX wasn't being valued on what it earns today, but on pure belief in what it might become tomorrow. And that's exactly why he won't be alone up there for long. Right behind him, there's already a small group breathing down his neck. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bernard Arnault. Empires built on tech, on retail, even on luxury. Completely different worlds, but all of them sharing the exact same secret. The fortune isn't in a vault. It's in pieces of companies the whole world decided to bet on. And this is where the most important part of the whole story lives. Because we tend to think these fortunes come from a product, the electric car, the rocket, and now, artificial intelligence. AI, by the way, is the bet of the moment, and Elon himself already has both feet in it. But deep down, it was never about the car. It was never about the rocket. And it won't really be about AI either. It was always about one single thing: the ability to make millions of people believe in a version of the future that hasn't happened yet. The technology changes. The name at the top of the list changes. But the mechanism is always the same. Whoever can convince the world to bet on their vision, whatever that vision is, will be the next one to sit in that chair.